The story begins on a quiet night in Akron, Ohio, in 1957. The streets were calm, and most people were home with their families. But for one young man, the night would change everything. His name was Frank Freshwaters, a man whose life, until that moment, had been mostly ordinary. He was 21 years old, just beginning his adult life, with plans and dreams that no one could have imagined would be interrupted by a single, fatal moment. If you love gripping true crime stories like this, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss any video. Frank was driving along a road, the engine humming beneath him, when tragedy struck. He struck a pedestrian named Eugene Flint. It was a brief, terrible accident, but the consequences were enormous. Eugene died at the scene. Frank's world, and the world of everyone connected to him, would never be the same again. In court, Frank admitted responsibility. He was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, a serious charge, though not the most severe. He was sentenced to serve time in a low-security honor farm, a kind of prison where inmates worked on farms or in small jobs rather than being locked in a high-security cell. The sentence was meant to last years, giving him a chance to pay for his crime and, ideally, learn from it. By most accounts, Frank seemed to adjust, but there was always a part of him that struggled with the walls around him. In September of 1959, just after serving a short portion of his sentence, something extraordinary happened. Frank walked away from the prison work camp. No one knows exactly how he did it. Some reports say he simply disappeared during work duty, blending into the world outside. There were no alarms, no dramatic chase. He was gone. When authorities realized he was missing, a search began. Guards checked the roads, neighboring towns, and even questioned friends and relatives. But Frank had vanished without a trace. It was as if he had slipped out of the story entirely, leaving behind only the life he had known and the crime he had committed. For most people, escaping from prison would mean living in fear every day. But Frank found a way to start over. He created a new identity, quietly blending into towns far from Ohio. He became William Harold Cox, or at least that is one of the names he used. Under this new identity, he began a life that no one could trace back to the young man who had walked away from an honor farm in 1959. He worked regular jobs, traveled, and made a life that seemed ordinary. People who met him would never suspect that he had once been a fugitive, hiding from justice for decades. He kept a low profile, and over the years, his existence became almost invisible to the world. Even so, the past has a way of lingering. In 1975, Frank's life intersected with the law once more. He was arrested in Charleston, West Virginia, under one of his assumed identities. The authorities in Ohio were alerted and requested his extradition. But the governor of West Virginia at the time, Archmore, refused. Local officials spoke on Frank's behalf, noting that he had lived quietly, worked honestly, and caused no further trouble. He was allowed to remain free. After that incident, Frank disappeared from official attention once again. For decades, he moved quietly from place to place. He lived in small towns, often in the southeast, and worked modest jobs. Authorities in Ohio had no new leads. For more than 50 years, Frank Freshwaters, the man who had walked away from justice, remained unseen and unaccounted for. The irony of his life was striking. A man who had once been a criminal in the eyes of the law spent more time as a law-abiding citizen in hiding than he ever had in prison. He paid his debts in his own way, though the law did not know it. And yet, every day carried the risk of discovery. One wrong move, one neighbor who asked the wrong question, could unravel everything. Life in hiding required careful planning. Frank avoided attracting attention. He used different names, obtained identification under aliases, and even filed for Social Security benefits under a false identity. This was not done recklessly. It was methodical, careful, almost routine. Each step he took was a calculated measure to ensure his continued freedom. Despite the carefulness, there was always the tension of being caught. It is hard to imagine living for decades knowing that any moment could end in arrest. Frank carried this tension quietly, blending into communities, becoming someone people trusted without ever suspecting his secret. Neighbors knew him as a quiet, hardworking man. He volunteered in small ways, said hello, helped where he could. There were no alarms raised. To them, he was simply another member of the town, a man like anyone else. Time passed. The world changed. The cities, the roads, the laws, and even the way police investigated crime evolved. And yet, Frank's secret life continued, almost imperceptibly. He remained a ghost in plain sight, known to no one as the man who had walked away from a prison work camp in Ohio. It was not until the 21st century that technology and determination brought him back into the light. The U.S. Marshals established a cold case unit, a team dedicated to solving cases that had long gone dormant. They studied old records, scanned archives, and followed leads that had grown cold over decades. Among the cases was that of Frank Freshwaters, still officially wanted, still technically an escaped inmate after more than 50 years. The cold case unit pieced together clues that spanned decades. They studied old photographs, compared fingerprints, and followed records of Social Security claims, addresses, and work history. Slowly, methodically, the web of Frank's life was reconstructed. Meanwhile, Frank continued living quietly in Florida. He had settled in Melbourne, a small city where his presence drew little notice. He lived in a trailer park, conducted his affairs quietly, and remained almost invisible to the world outside. If anyone had known who he truly was, they did not say anything, and he continued to live under the radar, decades after the life he had once lost. But the law was coming closer. In 2015, the U.S. Marshals finally located him. It was not a dramatic chase or a violent confrontation. Instead, it was precise, deliberate, and careful. Agents observed him, confirmed his identity, and prepared for the arrest that would finally bring closure to one of the longest-running fugitive cases in U.S. history. On May 4, 2015, Frank Freshwaters was confronted. The agents showed him photographs of his younger self, fingerprints, and documents linking him to the decades-old crime. There was no struggle. He admitted his identity. The man who had walked away from an honor farm in 1959 was finally caught. The capture made headlines across the country. Reporters marveled at the story. A man who had vanished for more than half a century, living freely while officially being a fugitive, was finally brought to justice. It was a story that highlighted the passage of time, the persistence of law enforcement, and the strange, unpredictable paths a human life can take. Yet, even with his arrest, the story was not yet over. Public opinion had shifted in strange ways over the decades. Many people wrote letters in support of Frank, noting that he had lived quietly, caused no further harm, and had effectively been a model citizen despite his past. The question of justice became complex. Should the law punish a man who had, for 56 years, lived without causing trouble, or should it honor the original sentence and the life that was lost in 1957? Frank's story was more than just a crime. It was a story about choices, consequences, and the long shadow of the past. It was about the human ability to survive, adapt, and live under pressure. And it was about a world where time can pass in strange ways, leaving questions that may never be fully answered. By the end of that first chapter of his life, Frank Freshwaters had become a symbol of one of the most unusual fugitive cases in American history. A man who had escaped justice not by trickery or force, but by quietly disappearing and living a life of relative normalcy, had finally been brought to light. But as we will see, the story does not end with his capture. What followed would test ideas of justice, forgiveness, and the long consequences of a single night in 1957. After more than 50 years of living quietly, Frank Freshwaters' life of secrecy was about to end. The U.S. Marshals Cold Case Unit, a team specially created to track down fugitives who had eluded justice for decades, had pieced together his trail. They weren't chasing leads that were fresh. They were digging through dusty files, yellow documents, and decades-old fingerprints, trying to locate a man who had learned to vanish like a shadow. The unit studied old Ohio court files, Social Security records, and employment documents. They knew that Frank had used aliases, had worked multiple jobs, and had moved between states to avoid detection. It was like assembling a giant jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. But persistence was their tool. They looked for patterns, repetitions, and small mistakes that only time could reveal. One of the breakthrough clues came from Florida. Records indicated that a man living under one of Frank's assumed names was receiving Social Security benefits. That alone didn't prove anything, but it gave the marshals a location to focus on. Surveillance was set up quietly. Agents watched from a distance, noting his routines, his comings and goings, the rhythm of a life that had seemed ordinary to neighbors. Frank lived in a small trailer park in Melbourne, Florida, far from the cities and from the chaos of his early years. The park was quiet, and he kept to himself. Some neighbors occasionally saw him walking his dog or working on small repairs around his trailer, but they had no idea about the man's extraordinary past. To them, he was just another retired man living quietly among them. The Marshals approached their task carefully. After decades of living on the run, Frank was no longer a young man. He was older, wiser, and familiar with the need for caution. But the agents were patient. They observed him for weeks, learning when he left the trailer, when he returned, and when he was alone. Every movement was noted. Every small detail mattered. Finally, the day came. On May 4th, 2015, the U.S. Marshals confronted him. They weren't looking for a fight. They weren't staging a dramatic raid with shouting and handcuffs in the streets. Instead, they approached calmly, with respect, and with proof. They showed him old photographs, fingerprints, and documents linking him to the case from Ohio decades earlier. There was no need for force. Frank's life of secrecy had ended not with a struggle, but with quiet acknowledgement. He admitted who he was. The man who had disappeared from a low-security honor farm in 1959 had finally been found. After more than half a century, justice had caught up with him. But the story that followed was not as simple as an arrest. It was layered with questions about time, morality, and the meaning of justice. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines read, "Fugitive found after 56 years. Man who escaped prison in 1959 lives decades free. Cold case solved. Frank Freshwaters finally captured." The public was fascinated. How could a man vanish so completely? How had he managed to build a life that seemed normal after such a violent beginning? Commentators and viewers debated the story. Some saw a master of disguise, clever and resourceful. Others saw a man who had been lucky, surviving decades while others would have been caught. But most were curious about the human side, the choices, fears, and quiet life that had made his long disappearance possible. After the arrest, Frank was extradited to Ohio. The legal process was straightforward in theory. He had escaped justice, and he was expected to serve the remainder of his sentence. But decades of law-abiding behavior complicated the matter. Public opinion, letters, and editorials began pouring in. People who had learned about his capture argued that the man before the court was not the same person who had walked away in 1959. Thousands of letters arrived at the Ohio Adult Parole Authority, written by strangers, friends, and even people who had never met him. They told stories of someone who had lived quietly, avoided trouble, and contributed to his communities. Some argued that punishing him now would serve little purpose, while others believed that justice should follow the law, regardless of circumstances. Meanwhile, journalists and documentarians explored his life. They highlighted the 1975 arrest in West Virginia, when the governor refused to extradite him. They explored his decades of work, the anonymity he had maintained, and his ability to stay unnoticed. It became clear that Frank had not only survived on the run, but had done so without further harming anyone. Court hearings were scheduled. The parole board, prosecutors, and defense lawyers debated what should happen next. Should he serve time for decades-old crimes, or should his long record of good behavior be considered? The hearings were emotional. People discussed not just law, but morality, redemption, and the passage of time. The media captured the tension perfectly. One reporter wrote, "Frank Freshwaters walked away from the law over 50 years ago. Today, he is back in the light, facing not just punishment, but the judgment of a society that has watched him disappear and reappear like a ghost." And in the middle of it all, Frank remained quiet. He did not give interviews. He did not argue publicly. His lawyers spoke on his behalf, presenting the story of a man who had lived decades under an assumed identity, keeping peace and avoiding conflict. They emphasized his age, his health, and the time he had already spent living under the shadow of his crime. The parole board faced a difficult decision. It was clear that Frank's capture was a victory for law enforcement. The cold case unit had succeeded in one of the longest hunts in U.S. Marshals history. Yet, the board also had to consider decades of law-abiding conduct, public support, and the fact that punishment so long after the original offense might not achieve justice in the way it would have in 1959. Finally, after careful consideration, the board made its ruling. Frank Freshwaters would be granted parole, with supervision, recognizing the complexity of his life and the long years he had lived quietly. The news sparked a mix of reactions. Some celebrated the decision as humane and just. Others felt uneasy that a man who had escaped justice for more than 50 years would not serve additional prison time. Even after the decision, Frank's story continued to capture imaginations. It became a case study in time, morality, and the human ability to adapt. Scholars, journalists, and legal experts debated questions like, can someone redeem themselves simply by living quietly after a crime? Does escaping justice erase the responsibility for past actions? How do we measure punishment when decades have passed? To most people, it was a story that combined suspense, human drama, and the strange twists of life. A man who had walked away from a crime, evaded capture for more than half a century, and lived an ordinary life in plain sight, had finally faced the law, but in a world changed so much that justice itself became a question, not a certainty. In the end, the capture and parole of Frank Freshwaters were more than the end of a case. They were a reflection of how life can unfold in unexpected ways, how time changes circumstances, and how the shadow of the past can stretch across decades, even for someone who tries to live quietly. Neighbors in Melbourne, Florida, would remember him differently. Some remembered the man who helped with small favors, who nodded politely, and who kept to himself. Others learned, for the first time, that the quiet neighbor they had known for years was the man who had been America's long-lost fugitive. And so, the story of Frank Freshwaters entered the public imagination. It was a story not just about crime, but about escape, survival, identity, and the passage of time. A story that would make people wonder about their own lives, choices, and the secrets that might hide in plain sight. Yet, even with this chapter of his life resolved, questions lingered. What had it been like to live for decades with the law always looming, even unseen? How had he handled fear, loneliness, and the constant risk of discovery? And most importantly, how does a society reconcile decades of quiet redemption with a crime that could never be fully erased? As Frank Freshwaters prepared to leave the courthouse, under parole supervision, the world watched, fascinated. A man who had once been defined by a tragic moment in 1957 had, over the course of decades, rewritten his life in ways no one could have predicted. But even now, the story was not over. There was still one final chapter, one that would explore the aftermath, the human responses, and the long shadows left behind by one man's choices. With the parole board's decision, Frank Freshwaters' long journey through the shadows of the law entered its final stage. By 2016, he was officially released under supervision, a man who had lived decades on the run now returning to the world under the watchful eyes of the law. But this final chapter was not about confinement. It was about reflection, perception, and the strange intersection of justice and humanity. For decades, Frank had lived with one constant, the quiet tension of being a man in hiding. Every job, every move, every neighborly interaction had been measured, deliberate. He had built a life in small towns, under different names, avoiding attention yet blending seamlessly into his surroundings. By the time he was released, he had lived more years outside prison than inside. His survival had been based on caution, patience, and a kind of invisibility. Once free, Frank returned to a life that was ordinary in appearance, yet extraordinary in context. In Melbourne, Florida, he resumed his routines quietly. He became a figure of curiosity to neighbors who now knew his secret but were fascinated rather than fearful. Some remembered the quiet man who had waved politely in passing. Now, they learned that he had been a fugitive for over half a century. The contrast between the man they knew and the story reported in newspapers created a strange tension. Could a person be both a criminal and a law-abiding neighbor at the same time? The media followed his story closely. Documentaries, newspaper articles, and interviews explored not just his life of evasion, but the human side of it. The fear, the patience, and the quiet determination that had kept him free for so long. Experts debated his case endlessly. Some argued that his decades of law-abiding behavior demonstrated rehabilitation, even without prison walls. Others insisted that justice was measured by law, and an escaped convict should face consequences no matter how much time had passed. Frank himself remained mostly silent. He did not seek attention. He did not grant interviews. He understood that the story was no longer about him alone. It was about the human questions it raised. How much does time matter in punishment? Can decades of quiet living make up for one moment of violence? Is it enough to live well? Or must justice be served strictly according to the law? Letters continued to arrive from strangers. Some expressed admiration for his survival and long adherence to normal life. Others demanded accountability for the man who had once taken a life. Among these letters, there were stories of ordinary people grappling with extraordinary questions, reflecting the broader societal fascination with crime, morality, and redemption. In small ways, Frank adapted to the new reality. He lived quietly under parole supervision, obeying restrictions and checking in with authorities. He avoided drawing attention and remained polite and courteous to those around him. For someone who had spent decades hiding, the adjustment to regulated freedom was subtle but significant. The world around him had changed drastically since 1957. New technology, new communities, and new laws had reshaped the society he had evaded for decades. What had once been easy, a simple disappearance, was now impossible. Cameras, databases, and record-keeping made it far harder to remain invisible. The very tools that allowed him to hide before now helped the Marshals locate him. His story became a testament not just to his resourcefulness, but to how society itself evolves over time. As the years passed, Frank's story remained a topic of conversation among journalists and criminologists. It was cited in studies of long-term fugitives, cold cases, and the psychology of evasion. He became a symbol of one unusual truth, that not all criminals live the same life after their crime. Some spiral into further violence. Others, like Frank, adapt, survive, and live quietly. Ethically, his case continued to spark debate. Did the law fail by not capturing him earlier, or did society succeed by allowing him to live a peaceful life once he had changed? These questions are still asked today, precisely because Frank's life cannot be easily categorized. He was both a fugitive and a citizen, both a criminal and, in his later years, a man who caused no harm. Friends, neighbors, and those who followed the story reflected on the paradox of Frank's life. It was a story that challenged conventional ideas of justice, forcing people to consider the long-term effects of crime and punishment. It was also a story about patience and perseverance, from both the fugitive and the law enforcement officers who never gave up on finding him. Frank's case also highlighted the dedication of the U.S. Marshals Cold Case Unit, whose efforts spanned years of research, surveillance, and verification. Their work demonstrated that even after decades, justice can find its path. The capture itself was a quiet affair, but its implications were profound. It reminded the world that no matter how much time passes, the past can resurface, and accountability can be restored, even in subtle, measured ways. In reflecting on Frank's life, it is impossible to ignore the human elements. He was a young man who made a terrible mistake, a man who escaped the consequences, and a man who then lived decades in careful, quiet compliance with society's rules. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about morality, the passage of time, and the capacity for change. Can a person truly atone for their past by simply living well? Or is justice a fixed standard, unaltered by the choices one makes afterward? By the time Frank passed through the final stages of parole supervision, he had become, in many ways, a living lesson in history. His life spanned crime, escape, evasion, capture, and redemption, all across a half-century. For those who studied his case, Frank was more than a man. He was a reminder that human lives are rarely simple, and the consequences of actions ripple long and far beyond the moment in which they occur. Ultimately, Frank Freshwater's story is not just a story about a crime, nor merely about a long escape. It is a story about the unpredictability of life, the endurance of human adaptation, and the complex intersections of law, morality, and personal change. It is about a man who vanished into history, only to be found decades later, and how even the quietest life can carry a dramatic, unforgettable story. As the years went on, Frank lived the remainder of his life quietly. Neighbors would remember him as a polite, unobtrusive man. Historians would remember him as a fugitive who managed the extraordinary feat of disappearing for decades. And the public would always be intrigued by the strange paradox of his life. A man who had walked away from justice, only to live decades in a way that no one could have imagined, quietly becoming part of the world he had once escaped from. The story of Frank Freshwaters is now complete, a tale that spans nearly 6 decades, from tragedy to escape, from decades of evasion to capture, and finally to reflection and release. It reminds us that life is unpredictable, the past can never be fully erased, and sometimes justice and humanity intersect in unexpected ways. In the end, his life leaves a question for every one of us. If someone has truly changed, if they have lived quietly, peacefully, and without harm, how should the world measure justice? Through punishment alone? Or by considering the full story of a human life, including the years spent in quiet redemption? Frank Freshwater's story will always linger in the public imagination, a man who vanished, survived, and lived a life that challenged everything we think we know about crime, consequence, and the passage of time.